C-50.
Senator Coyle. Keep the jobs, cut the carbon, build the future. Colleagues, this is the slogan of Blue-Green Canada, a membership organization comprising labour, environmental, and think tank organizations. Colleagues, keep the jobs, cut the carbon, build the future is in essence the purpose of Bill C-50, an act respecting accountability, transparency, and engagement to support the creation of sustainable jobs for workers and economic growth in a net zero economy, the economy of Canada's future and the economy of the world's future. While we cut the carbon and build our future net zero emissions economy, we need to ensure we have good quality jobs for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Colleagues, 5 years ago, the government committed to introduce legislation to support workers while unlocking economic opportunities. In February of 2023, the government released an interim sustainable jobs plan for 2023 to 2025. That plan outlined 10 actions, including the commitment to introduce this legislation. This legislation aligns with the United Nations Agenda 2030 and specifically with a number of Sustainable Development Goals, including Goal 7 on affordable and clean energy, 8 on decent work and economic growth, 9 on industry, innovation and infrastructure, 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and 13 on climate action. Senator Yousaf, the eminently qualified sponsor of Bill C-50, has explained the background of the bill, highlighted its key elements, and cited support for Bill C-50 from various quarters. I will just remind you of a few of the points that he made. It's been a little while. The bill is fundamentally about workers, protecting their rights and interests, supporting their families, and enabling their communities to grow. Climate change is causing economic change. Change can be good, or change can be devastating. Recognizing change and having the will and means to prepare our economy and those who work in it to embrace that change is of fundamental importance. Bill C-50, the Canadian Sustainable Jobs Act, articulates a number of guiding principles. It establishes a Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council with representation from labour, industry, Indigenous communities, environmental organizations, and other experts. It will designate ministers responsible for planning and implementation. It will create a Sustainable Jobs Secretariat to assist and coordinate federal actions, and it requires updated action plans every 5 years. As Canada works hard to align its workforce policy with its climate policy, this act will ensure workers have a seat and a voice at the table. Senator Bellemare, our in-house economist, spoke at second reading as well, agreeing with the fundamental principles of C-50 and saying it's important to facilitate a labour market transition. However, she did raise some questions about some of the details in the bill. As she said, the devil is in the details. She questioned whether Bill C-50 will actually allow a labour market transition plan to be developed and implemented within a reasonable time frame and with noticeable results in terms of sustainable jobs. Senator Bellemare reminded us that the employment insurance system in Canada remains the primary source of funding for public interventions in the labour market. She also highlighted important studies on the impact of the green transition on the labour market, which show that success of these plans depends heavily on the workforce's ability to carry out these plans. She cited a Canadian Chamber of Commerce report stating, a recent study scanning 48 countries found that only 1 in 8 workers has the skills relevant to a net zero economy, and that there's a growing demand for workers with the net zero skills, but this demand is not being met by today's workforce. Senatrice Bellemare said that the green transition will create new jobs and also transform existing jobs. She cautioned that Canada's economy is affected by the accelerating changes in climate, technology, including AI, and demographics. Skills upgrading will play a vital role in workforce development in Canada, and it will be one of the major funding. EI will be one of the major funding sources. Given this, Senator Bellemare suggests that EI commissioners sit on the Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council, and that those with the labour and industry seats on the council be appointed to represent the most representative workers and employers associations, rather than on a personal or individual basis. She ended her second reading speech with a call for urgency. Colleagues, on this matter of urgency and on the matter of the context of this labour transition, I wanted to share with you some points relevant to our debate on the Canadian Sustainable Jobs Act, made by panelists at our recent Senators for Climate Solutions session. It was entitled, Keeping the Lights On, Ensuring Energy Security and Stability During the Transition to Net Zero and Beyond. I will quote excerpts from the presentations of two panelists, Dr. Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, and Monsieur Mathieu Johnson, Hydro-Quebec's Vice President, Strategy and Development. Dr. Birol provided a snapshot of some of the indicators and the trends of the global transition to net zero. He said, and I quote, "Energy is at the heart of the climate debate because more than 80% of emissions causing climate change come from the energy sector, which means without fixing the problem in the energy sector, we have zero chance to reach our climate goals. The most important sector in energy use is electricity generation. In 2023, of all power plants built in the world in that year, last year, 85% of them were renewables, with about 5% nuclear and 10% with fossil fuels. As for transportation, only 4 years ago, 1 in 25 cars sold in the world was electric. This year, it's expected that 1 out of 5 cars sold will be electric. In China, almost every second car sold today is electric." Dr. Birol continued, "Our numbers show that this year, the total energy investments in oil and gas, renewables, nuclear, etc., are about $3 trillion US. Of this $3 trillion, $1 trillion is for fossil fuel investments, and $2 trillion is for clean energy investments, with clean energy investments doubling in the last 10 years. I notice a trend here. Dr. Birol says there are 3 reasons for that. One is simple economics. Renewables are now cheaper compared to fossil fuel alternatives. Solar is the cheapest source of electricity generated in most parts of the world. The second reason is energy security. Many governments understand that clean energy is not just good for the environment. Since green energy is usually generated locally, reliance on other countries, I will not name them, will be reduced, thus resulting in greater energy security. The third reason for clean energy investment and fast clean energy transition is industrial policy. Today, when you look at clean energy manufacturing, solar panels, windmills, batteries, electrolyzers for hydrogen, there's one country dominating in the world, China. And it is not necessarily driven by climate policies, but it is by China's industrial policy." End of quote. Dr. Birol illustrated how quickly the transition is moving and how industrial policy and global climate policy have come together. Our panel discussion also looked at the real-world case of Hydro-Quebec, the 4th largest hydro producer in the world. Vice President Mathieu Johnson spoke of the scale and scope of the challenge his company faces in this transition. I'll share just a few key excerpts. He said, I'm quoting him, "I'll start by sharing with you what is keeping us up at night at Hydro-Quebec. Historically, what utilities have been doing when they do forecasts is they ask themselves, what's going to happen by 2050? And then they do an action plan according to what they think is in their crystal ball. We at Hydro-Quebec used to do that. If we take this approach, we will not get to carbon neutrality by 2050 because we're asking ourselves the wrong question. It's not what is going to happen, but rather what needs to happen by 2050 in order to meet the targets that we set as a society, starting with the outcome and do the reverse engineering to identify what actions we need today. Now, that might change. There's a lot of disruption. There are new technologies, so the plan will evolve. We need to double the electricity produced in Quebec in order to be carbon neutral by 2050. We're going to have to build the same capacity in the next 25 years that it took us 80 years to build previously. That is the scale of the challenge. There will be new hydro, and we're also going to rely on wind power in Quebec. Just in the next 10 years, we will need to cover an area equivalent to 15 times the area of the island of Montreal with wind turbines. It's enormous. To connect the power to the consumer, we will need 5,000 new kilometers of transmission lines. Currently, we've been investing an average of $4 billion a year on capital expenditures. For the next 10 years, Hydro-Quebec will have to invest over $150 billion on capital expenditures. The biggest challenge we, in this case Hydro-Quebec, have is the workforce. If we don't have the workers, we will not be able to spend all that money to build new assets in order to electrify. Even at our current rate of annual capital expenditure, we're experiencing serious labor shortages. We estimate that we will need 35,000 employees just to work on our projects in Quebec over the next 10 years. At peak, that will be 20% of the current construction workforce that we have in all of Quebec. We need to change the way we do things. The recipe that we've been using for the last 80 years cannot be the recipe for success for the next 25 years. End of quote. Mr. Johnson particularly stressed the importance of forging a completely new kind of relationship with Indigenous partners. Now, the urgency that Senatrice Bellemare spoke of becomes immediately real when we listen to Hydro-Quebec's Vice President Mathieu Johnson's telling of the scope, scale, and pace of the challenges that important utility faces. Dr. Birol echoes the same scope, scale, and pace points on a global level. Colleagues, Canada cannot afford to miss this boat. Colleagues, we even have a chance to captain some new boats in this significant and historic industrial and labor transition to a net zero future. Many countries are already far down the road, or should I say stream, with the vote reference, in their efforts to keep the jobs, cut the carbon, and build the future. Honourable colleagues, let's move Bill C-50, the Canadian Sustainable Jobs Act, to committee for thorough study. Canadian workers need it. Canadian industry needs it. Our communities and regions need it. Colleagues, Bill C-50 is one essential component of our plans to ensure a prosperous and sustainable future for generations to come here in Canada and globally. Let's move it forward without delay. Thank you. Merci.